Hello, Cheryl. Delighted to be chatting with you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Terry, on this first coolish day of autumn with winter to come.
Is that official? Is that today, is it?
Well, I don't know, but
Oh,
no, but the day is quite cool. It's not necessarily the
yeah,
first day. Yeah,
yeah.
moving on, but it's not very warm today.
Okay, so we're not into the season of mists and mellow fruitfulness.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah. Oh, to autumn. You don't sound to me. I was going to say, how's life? Well, I know where you are, the Forest of Dean area. But are you from the UK? It doesn't sound like an English accent.
No, people get a little bit confused these days because I've been out of my home country of Australia for so long
Oh, yeah.
that I think my really strong Australian accent has gone. Not that it was very broad to
Just,
start with.
just a touch, I can hear.
Yeah, yeah. And lots of people kind of look at me and they say, "You're not from around here, are you?" Definitely not from the forest, because that's a very distinctive accent.
Yeah.
And I say yes, and they kind of guess Antipodean, but yeah, it's a bit confusing. But I haven't lived there since 1997.
That's a
So
long time. I would have guessed, I would have suggested New Zealand accent, maybe.
yeah, lots of people think New Zealand or English South African.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That,
yeah.
that, that
But I
just got
still come out with Australianisms that surprise my English husband every now and then. I come out with some phrase and he
yeah.
says, "What?" Never mind.
Yeah. How's life in that area? It's known for being the Tudors'
Oh,
hunting
yeah.
ground, isn't the Forest of Dean?
Yes, no. We we moved here in 2008,
Hmm.
took early retirement, and being Australian, I always wanted my cottage in the country, of course. Found a cottage in the country,
Yeah,
which we also did up completely, but we weren't living in it at the time.
yeah.
And I just love it here because it's such a great community. Everybody knows everybody.
Hmm.
Most people, their family roots go back generations. So you have to be really careful what you say
Oh, yeah,
about
yeah.
people. But it also means there's a very strong sense of community. And I've gotten involved in lots of things and made really good friends. So, and I started writing after I moved here as well. It wasn't
Hmm.
until we came here that
Yeah.
I actually started putting pen to paper. So I love it. I'm a forest girl now.
Okay. As Cheryl Mayo, you work as the chair of the Dean, the Writers' Circle, and founder of the Dean Scribblers.
Yes, Dean Writers Circle, as I like to joke, I joined there, and a few months after I joined, their chair decided to step down,
Hmm.
and I wasn't quick enough to step back when they called for volunteers. I was set up. I was really set up very well. But that's been three years. I've been chair 3.5 years, and it's a really good group. It's a very active group. It's been going since 1978,
Oh, yeah,
and we still have one member who actually joined in 1979,
yeah.
who's still very active. And we keep getting new members. We actually grew over the lockdown period because people had more time to think about doing things like writing and so on. I think we have about 26 members on our books, and we have about a dozen, 14 active members.
Hmm.
So it's good.
Yeah,
It's really good. I've learned a lot through them. Learned an awful lot
yeah.
through them. And Dean Scribblers is something that myself and a colleague and my husband started up to work in mostly primary schools.
Hmm.
And it's a combination because we also have links with the History Society. It's kind of like working with the primary school's curriculum to go to the kids and talk about local history in the context of kind of, their bigger curriculum.
Yeah.
And then I bring in my Dean Writers colleagues and we spend time with the kids, helping them to craft their own stories and poems and so on around these particular incidents.
Yeah.
And then we produce anthologies for them. So the kids get their own book with their work published in it.
Brilliant. There is a great history in that area, isn't it, for the coal mine and the smelting steel and iron industry. So it's a rich history there for the kids to learn about.
Oh yes, and what's lovely. One of the other things that this was kind of my last contribution before I resigned as membership secretary of the History Society is we had a big heritage lottery program went on here for the last 5 years with lots of money, and there was some left over. So I said, do you know what we should do? We should get a children's history of the Forest of Dean written and produced.
Yeah.
And everybody said, what a great idea. And I happened to live across the road then from Andy C., who's a really well-known children's non-fiction author. And so I said to Andy, will you write this book for us? And bless him, he did. And then he went around all the 28 schools afterwards, kind of talking to the kids about the history of the forest and talking about the book.
Yeah.
And I worked with him over, gosh, a 2-year period, pulling together images and taking down copyrights and all this kind of stuff. And it's been a huge success. And kids and adults, teachers have just, been blown away by this. So very proud of that. Very proud.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. Yeah. You've got a great back catalogue of historical and fantasy fiction. Can I ask you about Holborn House? Is this a traditional publishing house, or is this a press that you've created and gone down the indie route?
No. In fact, all of my books that you've got up there behind you have been self-published right from the beginning. But there's a book sitting on my computer, which I co-wrote with another Australian, which is a piece of historical fiction about a young woman who was hanged for the murder of her husband in 1863.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting tale, and my co-author had researched this for years. Anyway, we wrote the book, but my friend in Oz is insistent that we get this thing traditionally published.
Yeah.
So mostly me, I spent 3 years in the Korean trenches trying to get this book picked up by an agent or a press.
Hard work.
We had some full requests, and we had some partials, and we had lots of silences, the normal stuff,
Yeah.
And I mean, in the end, I just came to, she actually fell ill during this period, not because of this, because of something else, because why it fell to me, it wasn't her fault.
Yeah.
And in the end, I just thought all this effort that I put into learning what size font this agent wants, or what's on their manuscript wish list, or, how many words do they want in the synopsis, all this trivia, I could be putting this effort to better use learning how to self-publish. So I ditched that, and for the last 2 years, I've just gone full bore on the self-publishing route, which has its own challenges.
Okay, because just looking at the images behind me, the book covers, they're excellent. They look professional. I'm not disparaging other indie readers, but to me, they look, they smack of quality.
Thank you ever so much. I mean, that's a steep learning curve, because I don't have a graphic design bone in my body, but you do kind of learn in the end what looks right and what doesn't look right. And my husband is actually my publisher. He is very into this, and he not just for me, but for other projects as well. And he and I have learned together how to do this. So what you see there with the Guardians books, The Wild Army, Griffin Magic, and Quests must be there somewhere. They were the first ones that we had to learn on, and the very original covers for those books were absolutely diabolical. They were just awful.
Amateur.
Yeah, well, in 2018, I completely rewrote that trilogy, and with all the craft that I'd learned, and we retitled them and republished them under these names, and with these covers. And we designed those ourselves. Legend of the Winged Lion, the griffin on there has an interesting history, because my half-brother, who lives in Thailand, is a silversmith.
Oh, yeah.
And so I said to him, would you kind of draw me a silver griffin? And he said, well, I can't draw you one, but I can make you a 3D model on computer software. Yeah. So he did. And subsequent to us using it on the cover, he actually created these from a 3D printer, painted them silver, and I have these 2 little griffins, and the kids in the schools just love them. These little silver griffins. But I had professional help from a Twitter mate for both Keepers and Legend of the Winged Lion, and River Witch was designed for me by a professional cover designer. Lauren Wilmore, who just did a beautiful job.
It's,
So yeah,
I'm looking at your Amazon page now, and it's the sort of the promotional material beneath the books as well. That again, that stands out as being totally professional. Well, it looks superb. It's very nice on the eye.
No, thank you. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
I think my favorite is the River Witch cover, because she just so captured what I wanted there, that kind of Victorian feel and the kind of mystery in the river and so on. And it's just, I just love it. Yeah.
Yeah. You've had, well, you mentioned then that you started off a couple of years ago, but over a 2-year period, it's 7 books.
Longer than that, more like 4 years. So, because
this is a relaunch. I was looking at the dates on the Amazon page. That suggests that it was a 2-year period, but obviously you can update them, can't you?
Yeah, because it was November 2018 that I relaunched Guardian series.
Okay.
So they first went out about 2016, I think. So that was three books, and they're each about 55,000 words. So that's quite substantial.
It is.
Yeah. And then Legend is a similar kind of length. But after Guardians, Keepers came out in April 2021. And then I published Dragon Gift, the collection of short stories, which is very slim. I published that in July last year. And then Legend of the Winged Lion in February this year. And River Witch has just come out in the last week. So, but each of those I've been working on for a couple of years or more. So I'm madly scribbling away now on a sequel to Keepers, because I'm thinking, oh God, what am I going to publish next year? Hurry
up. We'll focus on the latest release. We can just go back to, tell me about the Guardians of the Forest series. It's the same as a sort of teenage children's audience.
It's the audience ranges. They're kind of theoretically middle grade, which is kind of like 9 to 12 years old.
Yeah.
But what I've found is kids that age really like them. But also their mums and dads and grands really love them as well. So I was very inspired by Narnia and Tolkien.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah.
But how these books came about is, I don't know if you remember, in about 2010, the government thought it might sell off England's public forests. Do you remember the great outcry?
Well, everything else has been sold off. I think probably the last to go.
There was a national outcry over this, and the MP for Islington was worried about how many hundreds of thousands of letters he was getting every day. But here in the forest, where they've tried that trick over many, many centuries, they've tried to take away foresters' rights, long history. They galvanized themselves into action, and I got very heavily involved. It's how I met a lot of people actually in the forest. I kind of wiggled and got myself onto the steering group, even though I didn't know anybody. I just rang around and said, "I want help, want help, want help." Yeah. We won, of course, that time.
Brilliant.
And it was after that I was dog walking in the forest, and I thought, there could be the basis of a story here. So it ended up fantasy. So the whole theme of the Guardians is about a warlord who wants to destroy the forest for his own purposes and enslave the people who live there. And young Callie, who's just a young girl of the village, she gathers together a ragtag crew of wild creatures to actually battle these oppressors. And what happens from there. So yeah, fun books.
Brilliant. There's 4 in the series. Have you got any more planned? Have you got some in the pipeline?
I do, actually, because Legend is a prequel. So that goes back, eons before, and tells how various things like the horses that can fly, etc., came about. Oh, that was a spoiler.
Of course it was.
But of course, it was really interesting writing the prequel after I'd written the main series and thinking, well, how did that come about? I better make up a good story to actually explain that, and various other things, how they arrived. So it is a standalone, but to people who read the series, they go, oh, yes, of course. I do have a sequel drafted somewhere on my computer that I haven't looked at for years. and I might get around to that when I've got various other projects out of the way. So we shall see.
Okay. I said that you've recently launched the latest novel, The River Witch. Is this aimed at a more adult audience, or
Yes,
tell me about it? Yeah.
It's an adult magical realism book,
Yeah.
so, or historical fantasy as it's otherwise called. It's a genre that people like Louis de Bernier kind of, made well known through his South American trilogy, The War of Don Emmanuel's Nether Parts, etc. It's a genre that I love. What it does is it kind of puts mostly historical, kind of the real world. So it's set in our universe. So it's not a made-up world, but there are spiritual elements to it. So it's not like a witch kind of novel where there's magic and so on. It's more that in River Witch, the protagonist Hester speaks to the river, or the river talks to her, and she sees the river nymphs who live in the river. And they're always entreating her to come and join her and so on. So she has these kind of spiritual powers that need to be realized. But in her day-to-day job, she's a farm girl, she's a farmer's daughter.
Yeah.
So very kind of prosaic. The book is set here in the forest and along the banks of the River Severn, which divides us from South Gloucestershire. And the river here, the River Severn, was actually known by the Romans as Sabrina, as a goddess.
Sabrina, was that, Cheryl?
Yeah, Sabrina. Yeah, River Severn was called. And there's a whole background in the story to why it was called Sabrina, about a princess, I think a Germanic princess who was enslaved and brought here, and one of the local kings fell in love with her and hid her away somewhere, and then she was captured and she was thrown into the river, and her soul kind of lives on in the river. I have a blog post on it somewhere on my website. Very interesting. We also have another kind of part of the book is there's a sacred well that plays a part in the story, and we have our own sacred well here in the forest as well. So I took my kind of inspiration from that as well. Plus, of course, as you mentioned before, the rich kind of history and heritage, and salmon fishing and elver fishing were one of the huge industries here in the forest. And so my book, and there were major ports in this part of the world as well. So I've set my book in those kind of times when there was this big port on the river, and the salmon industry was going very strongly and so on. So I've blended those kind of aspects of history with the local legends and myths. It was fun to write.
Oh. Is River Witch, is it a standalone, or have you planned a series for this?
No, it's I don't really do series. I get bored doing stuff. So River Witch is a standalone, but it was only released on Friday, and I've been getting the most wonderful reviews for it, which have just blown me away.
Brilliant.
And not from my friends and relatives either.
You didn't pay them, no.
No, and one of them kind of said, "Oh, I really hope there's a sequel." No, two of them have actually said, "I really hope there's a sequel." And I'm going, no. So no, people are loving Hester and Aaron, the protagonists, and they're kind of will they, won't they get together questions. So it's a bit of a romance, but it's more than that. Yeah.
You touched upon the sort of the real history. How much research you put into the work? Is that a major part of the writing?
I'm a lazy researcher, Terry, to be honest. I kind of
Google.
Google is my friend. And also here locally, belonging to the local history society, of course,
you've got
a lot about stuff in any case.
Yeah.
I mean, Keepers actually is a really good example, because Keepers is set in Australia in the 1950s, and it's very loosely based on my own family history. And I've had wonderful comments from people saying, oh, so much detailed research must have gone into this to make the setting so real and history and so on, so alive. And I'm thinking, yes, the detailed research was that I lived there at the time. I mean, I was only a baby, but you know, this was the city, etc., that I grew up in. So I knew all these things. So that was quite easy. But even there, of course, I mean, some of that story takes place up in the Snowy Mountains, in the vast hydroelectric scheme that they built up there from 1949 to the early 70s. And I mean, I knew very little about that, so I had to do quite a bit of research around that. So, which was very interesting. And also about migrants coming to Australia after the war. And many people said, especially American readers, said, oh, we didn't know they had migrant camps in Australia, because people think of migrant camps now as being places. And they weren't necessarily. They didn't get them locked in, put it that way.
So there's a such of authenticity then, isn't there? You know, you've got the family memories of these places and locations. Can I ask you about the plotting for your novels? Do you write down bullet points? Do you create the plot first, or just sort of let it flow?
I used to have a kind of a general idea of where I wanted the story to go, and then kind of write, and things would happen. But then, of course, you have to go back and rearrange stuff. I mean, River went through so many developmental edits of reorganizing things, and as ideas would come to me, having to rewrite some of the back and so on. But so it's a pretty inefficient way of writing, but it does, which is why it takes me 2 years. But with this current book I'm working on, the sequel to Keepers, I found myself really stuck trying to do that. So what I did is I sat down one afternoon and I literally just wrote out a summary, a kind of a scene by scene, this point of view, then that point of view, and this point of view, that point of view, and the key kind of things that were actually going to happen. And now I'm using that as the guide to write, and it's making it much easier. And doubtless that will change as I get more into the characters' heads and really work out what it is that they want and what they're going to do. But at least now I've got something to start me off as I write it. So I'm finding that quite helpful.
It was like a piece of clay that you're molding into shape.
Yes. Actually, my last newsletter, there was a blog post on that very question, plotting versus pantsing. And I did a poll on Twitter and asked people what they did, and the vast majority of them claimed to be pantsers and just let it all happen.
Do you allow the characters to come alive? I know you mentioned that you rarely plot. You do, let they go off in their own direction as you get to know their motivations and their desires.
One of the things that I learned early on, I love to study writing craft. One of the things that I learned early on was about deep point of view, sometimes also called close third, which is where
I've heard that before.
You actually write as if you are the character. So you become it's kind of like being an actor, really. You become the character. So you don't use phrases like she thought and she wondered and she heard. You kind of like the door slam. You wouldn't say she heard the door slam. You said the door slammed. You know, Larissa jumped, whatever. And in that way, you really end up getting into your characters' heads. And it's quite fun, actually, kind of thinking and acting like them and slipping from one character to another character. You have to be a bit of a chameleon. But I really enjoy writing that way. And now when I see people's manuscripts littered with thoughts and wonders, I go,
What's been the most successful of your books so far?
To date, Keepers has been, that's done reasonably well. River Witch looks like getting off to a really good start though. So I'm very kind of hopeful for that. So I'm really hopeful for River Witch because I think it's something that will appeal to a lot of people. It's more kind of a commercial genre. People's is women's fiction. The middle grade fantasy stuff, the market is full of middle grade fantasies. It's a very tough market. So yeah, I'm hopeful for that.
Yeah, touch wood. Yeah, we've connected on Twitter. Is that your main social media platform for promotions, or do you use Facebook and TikTok and Instagram?
No. I fell down the Twitter writing community hole a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago now. And I just, I've made some fantastic friends there and met some really nice people like you. And such wonderful support, and become really, really close to actually a number of people there that we kind of Zoom regularly and all this kind of thing, and look after each other, which is just great. But in terms of actually selling books, I think these days it's pretty much acknowledged that social media is a very, very small leg of that. Blasting things out on Twitter and Instagram. I would never go near TikTok. I can barely handle Instagram, Facebook, and I have an interesting relationship. But Twitter, I just love it because of the people there and the interactions and so on.
I see what you say.
If you want to sell books, you have to kind of invest in a little bit of money. You have to work out, what kind of promotions to use and what's good value for money and when to do it and where to do it and so on. And it takes a long time to learn that stuff.
I've chatted to a couple of other writers that they've said, and I agree, a lot of writers, to promote their work, they'll just post their book on Twitter, buy my book. There's no other engagement, just this, and you tend to just scroll past, you get to more interesting bits, what's happening in a writer's life, or what they're working on.
Absolutely. I mean, Twitter, I've certainly sold books to people on Twitter, but that's because they know me, and they've taken a chance on the book. But no, in terms of it just being, oh yes, I must buy that book, because you see, as you know, so many books going past, and we all do it. It's kind of like this sort of feeding frenzy, and we all participate in these kind of, self-promotion things and so on, to kind of keep the book out there, which is fine. But if you're relying on Twitter to sell books,
I think that maybe one of the best, it builds up a brand, it puts your name in people's mind and an image, maybe. You touched on it before, but what advice would you give to a new writer, someone who's got a thought of getting words down on paper?
What I say to new writers, and I say this to my writing circles as well, we have a special novel group, is you've just got to put pen to paper or fingers to computer and just do it, and then send it to people who've got more experience than yourself, for them to gently but thoroughly pull it apart, because there's so much that you need to learn to actually write a good book. It's not just a case of blah blah blah, as I found out, and being willing to kind of to listen, to take on board advice, etc., is very important. And the other thing is to start much younger than some of us old people do.
I totally agree. I represent that remark myself.
No, it's really hard. I mean, how these people do it who have got young families and busy jobs, and they churn out novels as well. I mean, my hat just goes off to them, because it's just, amazing amount of energy to actually do that. So, good luck to them. Fantastic.
It's hard work. Yeah. That sounds like excellent advice. On that note, Cheryl, I'll say thank you very much, and let's keep in touch.
Yep, absolutely, Terry. Lovely to chat to you, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm delighted to.
I like doing that.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Cheryl.